Let's get started with building our graphical user interface. So before we actually start going in and writing code, we need to think about what it is we're going to be doing. We need a plan. So the main thing we need to keep in mind the whole time is our user and how we want to interact with our user and our actual code behind the graphical user interface. So when it comes to building a graphical user interface, there's three main things I need to be thinking about. One, I need to be thinking about my user. Two, I need to be thinking about the actual graphical user interface, the images, the buttons, everything that my user is seeing and interacting with. And then the code that's backing all of this. So the code that's saying what happens when my user clicks a button, what do I want to have change, all of the different logic. Where you start depends on what you want to do. So just to be very clear, my goals for all of these GUI videos that I'm building, so graphical user interface, there is a feature called guide in MATLAB. I will not be using guide. Now, this video can still be helpful in the idea of getting set up and getting started and thinking about your GUI to begin with. But beyond that, I'm not getting into guide. So if you're looking for help with guide, look elsewhere. If you're looking for help with how to actually hard code your own graphical user interface using UI control and a bunch of other functions, then this is going to be the set of videos for you. You could start off by just saying, okay, who's my user? What do I want to communicate with my user through the different interactions in that GUI? Or I could start just thinking about what do I want that actual image to look like? Or I could start off by thinking, okay, just the back end. What do I want to have happening? What's the logic I need to control everything that's going to be going on? And you could be thinking about this interaction between the actual image that you're seeing and the code behind it. Or you could say, nope, I'm only going to think about the code. And as far as what I'm going to display, I'll deal with that later. Or I'm only going to think about the image, and what I'm going to do with the code, I'll think about that later. As far as the best approach, it really depends on the scenario. So what's your code? What are your goals? What are you building? Are you building a game? Are you building a database? Are you building some type of simulation? What is it that you're building? I'm not going to give a hard, fast rule for each one. If you're developing a simulation, you're probably going to be starting with everything on paper or in Excel or some different type of software, and really just sitting there building that mathematical model, then getting into some code and getting some more logic in there and computerizing your mathematical model. So building a computational model, really thinking about that. And as you get further along in that process, then start to think about the visualization and what you want in that graphical user interface. And also thinking about what type of inputs you're going to have for your user to be interacting with. So again, those inputs and then what you're displaying, the outputs, and all that different type of information. And similarly, if you're building a database, you don't even want to start here most likely. Maybe you want to start thinking about your user a little bit, but a lot of times you probably want to start with the data. What's the actual data that you have? What do you have access to? And what are you going to be inputting into your code? So you really need to be diving into collecting that data and figuring out what you can even collect. Because the last thing you'd want to do is have this beautiful image of all these ideas of what you're doing and what's going to happen. And then you go to collect the data and you realize, I can't even get this whole list of data that I was planning on a quarter of my graphical user interface being. So that would be really troublesome. So before diving into the image, you'd really want to get into what data do I have access to. Now, on the other hand, games are the only one that I would say really a lot of times you might just start with your GUI. And that again would depend on the type of game, what you're doing, goals, all of that. You could start in the code and get an idea of what's the logic, what's the process of the game, how am I going to implement that into code? But a complicated thing about that is if I start coding all of these different variables and I'm saying, okay, this one is going to be numbers, I have another variable, it's going to be all strings, I have another variable and it's going to be a cell array, or I have another variable and it's going to be an array of a bunch of numbers. And then all of a sudden I come over here and I'm looking at my graphical user interface and I'm trying to think about, okay, what type of buttons do I have? And the data that I want in this button is different than the data here. There's going to be a lot of problems of trying to integrate those two things together. So it can get a little complicated. If you're not familiar with the logic of your game already, I would say at a minimum, start mapping it out, do like some tree logic, some flow charting, some algorithms, something to really get an idea of the logic so you're ready to code it. but it might make sense to start in the actual image that you're building. Now, it may be tempting because you're starting in the image component to jump on and just use guide. So there is a feature in MATLAB called guide. I'm not going to ignore it, don't worry, but I do not personally like it, especially for education purposes. If you're trying to learn and grow and understand the code in MATLAB better, this is going to limit you a lot because guide, you just draw a picture and it's going to generate a lot of code for you. So instead of really understanding how passing data works, all these different things work, you might get stuck in this loop of workarounds to try to work with a feature that can be a little bit challenging at times, especially when it comes to passing data. So yes, going this way that I'm going to talk about where you hard code it, it is a little more time consuming on the front end, but it gives you a lot more flexibility with what you can do with your actual graphical user interface and all the data you can pass and store and all the different components like that. If you're looking for just a quick GUI and it's really doesn't matter the functionality of it, you want to get done with it as fast as possible, then yeah, maybe I would recommend guide. Personally, I wouldn't mess with it unless, again, you have a very small project. Maybe it's something your work is requiring of you and you have no interest of getting into MATLAB or GUIs. Go for it, use guide. I'm not going to show videos on it because, again, I don't support the idea of using it. But if you actually see yourself doing something long term and you see yourself wanting to implement some type of visualization on simulations, databases, games, whatever it may be, long term, or even just over the next couple months, then I highly recommend going about this approach of, again, hard coding it, learning the UI control function, and just using that function a lot. So throughout a bunch of videos, I'm going to be going through all these different options of what types of things you can do in your figure. To dive into this further, I'm going to actually go through an example. So I'm going to code from scratch a graphical user interface for Tic Tac Toe. Since this is a game that has at least some logic in it, but it's fairly simple. And I'm going to approach it by starting with talking about my GUI that I'm planning out, like what am I envisioning for that image. So I've already done a video where I talked about how to set up your first figure. I recommend watching that one first. And then in this one, I'm going to dive into, again, planning out what am I going to do in that figure. And then the next couple of videos, it'll be all about coding that. And as I'm coding that, I'll be going through and doing the logic as well. And I will keep bringing in the user as I go through and code it, trying to think about what type of data do I need to collect from my user and what information do I want to display to them? What do I think would be interesting and keep them engaged? I'm not going to dive into the usability and the image that I'm using and how that user is interacting with that image. There's a lot of research out there about colors and aesthetically pleasing things for graphical user interfaces, but that's not my goal with this. I'm focused more on the end of how to code that actual GUI and how to work with the logic behind it. And again, just understanding how to interact with my user to begin with, not to the depth of what's existing. So a lot of times I try to keep all of my main GUI within one figure. So the majority of my gameplay will be in this one figure. Now, before I dive into that figure, it might make sense to have a initial figure or even just a pop-up window. There's a function called message box. So message box can be helpful if you want to just display some text, but you don't really care about the formatting of it really too much. You have a little bit of flexibility of changing that format, but not too much. So I could use a message box. If I do use a message box, just know there is a function called UI wait, and UI wait is a function that will say wait for the user to interact with whatever it is that your output box is. So I would just put that right in there. So I could have a little message box that says something like, welcome, I hope you enjoy Tic Tac Toe, because that's what you just logged into. And it would pop up a little thing automatically that says, okay. So at this point, right off the bat, I'm thinking about my user. So I'm thinking, okay, this person comes in and they're wanting to run my program. So I'm thinking, do they want to log in and see this big Tic Tac Toe board? And it just is like, I expect it to be intuitive, just get started and play. Or Do I want to give them some type of message that says, welcome, this is Tic Tac Toe, and then kind of break down maybe some instructions, maybe an image of what they're about to see with like little tutorial information of like, click here for this and click start or reset or exit or whatever buttons I may put in here. Like maybe I want to create like a figure that screenshots and shows all the little directory help information. Or if I want, I could have little help buttons related to every single button on here. So then they could get a tutorial that way. I could do an animation where it's just playing through and showing them how to interact with it. And then it launches into this. Again, there's a lot of different options. So just think about, well, what is it that I want to do? And also, what is it that I'm willing to commit to? Because a lot of those different options that I've discussed require a lot of different work. Saying hi is easy. Putting little helps on every single button starts to get very annoying. Doing an image of like my actual GUI with little notes, that's not too bad. Like that's pretty easy. I can do that. Um, if I'm doing different instructions of here's like little information on how to help you, that I would probably want in another image or another pop-up that comes up before my actual game, or I could have it as just one little help button of like, if they get stuck, click this, and then it shows up an image and explains all the different features that I have in my GUI. This isn't something you have to think about initially. You can always add more on later, but it helps to think about it initially because when I start writing my code, I can think, what's that first line? Am I going to start figure one here with instructions, or is figure one just right here? So again, thinking ahead of time of what's that first figure I want my user to see and what are my goals. Another thing with my user I really need to be thinking about here is tic-tac-toe is a two-person game. So am I creating this for two different people to be playing tic-tac-toe on this one board? And then, so it's just one user selecting and then another user selecting, I will need two users? Or am I doing a type of game where it's the user versus the computer? And that's something to think about. Or do I want more flexibility and I want to say, okay, you can pick, do you want it two player or do you want it one player versus the computer? Again, this opens up a whole different pathway of how to interact with this code. One way is all user interaction back and forth for collecting the data. And then the code on the other end is just looking at, okay, is there a tic-tac-toe that happens and I have to find it and identify it? Versus the other approach, I'm going to have more coding. There's more to do on the back end because I need some type of logic. So thinking about these two different options here, I want to go ahead and leave it open so my user can pick, do they want to do two player with two people or two player as in them versus the computer? So knowing I want to leave this option open, I think I want to have that potentially at a start page. So have an initial landing page where it's help information, provides them like about the GUI, like I was talking about, and an option of pick either them versus computer or them versus another player. So my first landing page that I want to do is probably going to be a page that's just saying welcome and I hope you enjoyed my code. This is how to use it. And kind of that picture I was talking about where I show a description of each different component on my main GUI and just kind of getting them familiar with what they're getting into. One of the benefits of having another figure is if they just close this, I can have it automatically pop up the next figure because sometimes people just close windows quickly. They don't want to have to deal with instructions. So planning on my user to be able to do that is probably a good idea. So in that mind, I'm going to have this be like a welcome help, and I might tell them like on every other page, there'll be a question mark somewhere and they can pull back this same figure. So then this same figure will come up and maybe it just doesn't have any kind of welcome message. It just has the help information. So the first option that I want to deal with is this two-player thing that I talked about here, or the playing versus the computer. So here I can get the idea of just saying, okay, one button, two button, there's going to be two different options. I know it's either going to be like person versus person, or it's going to be person versus computer. So then I'm going to have that option here. On this page, I could also do an additional thing where it's like, okay, if you are a player, then I'm going to allow you to pick some type of character or some type of picture rather than doing X's or O's. Or I can say, you can pick, do you want to be X? Do you want to be O? Or I can also even just say, I'm automatically going to assign this person to X, this person to O every time, doesn't matter. Or I'm going to randomize it and it's always going to be X or O. This is a place that I can, again, like think about what is the simplest solution. Now, the simplest solution might be automatically assigning X's and O's. But if I want the option later of like picking a character and having images displayed, my easiest solution might be having my user pick X or O for each player. And that way I already have the code in place. I already have that logic in place and the flow for them picking what letter they want to be. And that way later, if I want to change it to be different characters, images, or something like that, I'm already set up for that. Anytime we're diving into any type of program we're developing, it's always a good idea to think about, okay, what's the most simplistic solution I can do? And what's the coolest, most fun, crazy, complicated thing that I can have my users do? And then probably want to go somewhere in between. And again, like I'm saying here, ahead of time, I already know I probably want to do something like this later. So initially putting in my code, picking X and O sets me up to be able to do that more easily rather than coding X or O, hard coding it in or randomizing it and spending time doing that. I'm already saying, okay, I'm going to have the flow be the same, but then allow myself to add more complexity later if I want. And this deals with the project creep, like scope creep. If anytime you've done any type of project in engineering, I'm sure you've dealt with dealing with a customer or just within your team, you start coming up with these creative, wild ideas and you want to keep building and doing more and more and more. But then there's this deliverable and this deadline over here, and you're getting closer and closer and closer. And you keep thinking, oh no, we keep expanding our project out and we're going to bypass that deadline and then we need to scale it back. So it's a good idea, same thing here when I'm building this GUI, to be thinking about, okay, what are ways that I know I can scale back just in case I start taking way too much time or I get lost on some little task that's really not that important. It's more so just something that I think is fun or I think would be even better. Because just like any project, we have to be mindful of our deadlines, our deliverables. What do we need to be doing? So I'm already past my home page, that landing page, the initial place that I'm going, which is my help. And now I'm into my selection of my players. So then where do I go next? Well, most likely I'm going to just go straight to my actual game. So then let's think about what that figure is going to look like some too. So I'm going from the home page to my 2-player or the computer. And then from there, I'm going to now go to my main game. So I'm doing all of this on a whiteboard and I'm just going through and erasing it after I write it all, but keep in mind, I'm also recording it for you. So I have all of this documented. If you're going to do something similar like this, you might want to be doing this on paper, or if you are doing it on a whiteboard, be sure to take pictures so you remember these things when you're going and when you're actually coding and you can go back and refer to what you did. So the main thing I know is I'm coding Tic Tac Toe. So the bulk of my main page is going to be Tic Tac Toe, the actual game. Now there's a lot of different ways to approach this. For me, I'm just thinking the easiest way to begin with is each of these things is where my user is going to be interacting with and selecting X or O, which position, all of these 9 spots. So the first thing that I think to make this easy as possible is I have 9 different buttons right here. And these buttons my user can select and then place their X or O, or as you know, like hopefully later, maybe it's character or something else, depending on how far we take this project. Now, when it comes to actually coding these buttons in, we'll do that when we actually start diving into the code part. But right now I just need to have in mind, okay, I'm going to be putting in these 9 buttons. And then I want to think about, well, what other things do I really want on this figure? And I kind of already talked about somewhere on my figure, maybe in the top or the bottom, I want to have some type of help option. So then if my user clicks this help button, it pulls back up this initial home page. But again, instead of saying home, it would just say help. So then it would just have that help information and they could just close it and then this would just come back here. One thing I want to think about is, do I want to allow my user to change this option of player versus computer? Because I have this on a separate figure. And remember, I also talked about them being able to pick X or O. Do I want to have them go back and be able to change that? Sometimes in Tic Tac Toe, they have this hard rule of X always goes first. I'm not going to implement that because, as I said, I'm keeping in mind I might want to change this to images or characters or something fun later. So I don't want to have that be a hard set rule. And now I can have them select who goes first, or this is a place that I think for me, I will probably just add a randomization in. So regardless of what they pick, if they're playing the computer or playing another person, I'm just going to have it randomly select who goes first. And why I'm talking about that now is because I need to be aware of, like, do I need a button to say who's going to be first? And in this case, I don't, because I'm not going to do that. I'm going to randomize that. So that eliminates one thing I need to add on my GUI. And again, I still need to think about, do I want to go back and be able to change the modality that they're playing? This adds a little bit more complexity because, again, you have to pass the data, go back, go forward, all these different things. This isn't too bad to integrate in because, I mean, really, it would just be a button that's like, you are currently PvP or PvC and whatever, do you want to change that? I might want to add a warning message or something if they click this and say, keep in mind, if you change it, you're going to lose current progress in your game and it's just going to reset everything. And also, if I'm collecting stats, I might say, you're going to lose your stats of how you've been playing so far. Now, I might take their stats and store them somewhere, but I probably would register it now as a different set of people. So it could be player versus player, and then they could go here, and then they could still assign it player versus player again, but the stats reset, assuming that maybe it's two different people. So if I have two people swapping out and they want to change the stats, I mean, it'd be nice to have that button there. Or again, if somebody's sitting there playing it on their computer and they're just playing against the computer and someone comes along and they want to join them in, it might be nice to have a button there. I mean, I can always assume that they can just close out of the whole thing and then rerun the program from the beginning. It's not that big of a deal. It's not that important. But again, it's a decision I'm going to have to make. This is a decision I might wait to make. And when I'm actually generating the code and thinking about the flow of everything and what I'm doing, and again, thinking to myself, how much complexity does this add to my code and how important is it? And again, this is a question you want to be asking yourself all the time. How much complexity does it add to your code? How difficult is it to do? And how beneficial is it? If something is extremely complex, extremely difficult to do, and there's almost no benefit, it's probably a good idea just to say, no, I'm not going to do that. If something's very simple to code and it's going to make a huge difference for your user, you definitely want to do that. And now if it's somewhere in between where it's hard to tell, it's like, yes, it is kind of complex, but it could be pretty beneficial. Well, then that's a decision you have to make. It's not as obvious, but weigh the pros and cons. So something else that I mentioned that I don't have anywhere here yet is stats. So I probably want to have something that's a high score. So who's done the best and maybe some rankings, put that right here where it constantly reminds them like top 3 players. Or I could just say high score as a button, and then they could pull up another figure, which would then be all like my best players, high score 1 through 3, or all time, like 1 through 100, or whatever it is that I want to do. So keep in mind, I did just talk about an option of adding a 4th figure. And something else that I'm mentioning here that makes this be a little bit different is I'm talking about high scores. I have to think about here, do I want to collect every user's player name at the beginning? So right here, and then this would be a player, this would be a player, this would be a player. Obviously, I don't have a player name for the computer. I might just, if the PC has higher scores than everyone else, I could include them, or I could say, no, these are only going to be players. Something I can think about later. It's a small detail, not a big deal. So again, do I want to collect the player names here when I'm asking them, do they want to be X or O? What's your player name? I could ask it at this time, or I could ask it on this end. Only if they get a high score, then I actually collect their information. Some of it depends also is like, do I want to store all the data or do I only want to store data for people I consider to be the best? More data, more information, more potential for analytics. So I'll probably collect the player name over here and store all the data just for me to have some data to play with when I run this GUI. So another thing I can be thinking about is the ongoing game. Do I want some stats here about their ongoing game? So a lot of times it might be interesting to show them how many wins and losses, or what's the least amount of moves that somebody did to win. I have a bunch of different stats I can show. I can display this in different graphs or bar charts, whatever that may look like, pie chart, showing who's won the most or where are they at. I have a lot of options, but I just want to keep in mind that in this main figure, I'm going to want space to have this high scores and stats of the ongoing game and some type of stats with the high scores. And I may want a button in place where it pulls up another figure all about high scores or stats or different information. So this is a panel that is going to be important to keep in mind on my main figure. So remember at the beginning, I talked about those three main things. One, am I thinking about my user, how my user is going to interact with everything? Two, am I thinking about my actual GUI, what everything's going to look like? What's my figure going to be set up as? And three, the actual code itself. How am I writing that back end of what everything's going to look like? So here I've spent a lot of time focused on my GUI, but remember I have talked about my user throughout here. I have kind of talked about what type of code I'm going to have to back this. As far as the logic for Tic Tac Toe that I'm dealing with for that PC, I'm going to ignore that for now because I at least know in the back of my head how to play Tic Tac Toe. And again, I can start that computer as dumb as I want, where the computer just puts X's or O's, whatever their actual letter is, in the first available position, just going through and saying, okay, first available position is where you put your letters. Or as complex as, I really want this computer to be able to beat every person. Which again adds another element of, do I want some type of scale on here where it says easy, medium, expert, beginner, like all of those different areas and ways that the PC could be, and then it changes the logic of how the PC plays. Again, I've just added another thing on here where I can scale up or scale down, whatever I want that to look like. So I'm not going to dive into that now. I'm going to wait until I get a little bit further along. So the initial code, I'm just going to keep in mind, I want these two different modalities to happen. So I need to make sure that I'm setting up for that. And now that we have a pretty good mapping out of what everything's going to look like, I have these four main figures that I'm working with. This again is going to be primarily where everything is happening. I have some user interaction in the beginning just to figure out who my players are. And then I'm diving into my game. And then they have on the output some stats if they want to dive into what has happened when people are playing this game. A third option I could add into here, if I really wanted to continue outside of the scope of my project, is I could say, I want to do PC versus PC option. So then there's a third option here, and the computer plays the computer and somebody watches the computer play the computer. And one might be smarter, one might be dumber. They can change the levels of those different computers and see how they perform. I am not going to do that. So I have already thought of something that I'm saying, no, this is way outside the scope of what I'm doing. Don't go there. So again, be sure to be okay with exploring and thinking and brainstorming, being creative, going outside of the scope of what you want to do. But be sure you're okay with also scaling it back and bringing yourself back to what are my main goals? What is my main purpose for this program? And keep in mind, as we're going through encoding, I'm going to be taking a lot of notes and putting comments in my code. And that's going to be to help myself, because later I might go back and say, you know what, actually, instead of Tic Tac Toe, I want to make this Connect 4. And all of a sudden, I need a lot more boxes. So I need a lot more buttons on here, and I want to have notes to keep in mind, how do I scale this up now? Or I might look at it and say, you know what, now I do want to go back and add this third option of PV. Now I do want to go back and add this third option of PC versus PC. And the more notes I take, the easier it will be for me to look at this code much later, potentially a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, at any other time, and say, you know what, I want to go revise it. If I don't write any comments as we go through and we start coding, I will probably forget most of what I did and why I did it that way, unless I rewatch this video. But do I really want to have to rewatch a whole video? But are you going to be documenting everything to have a video of what it is you did? So again, comments are key. We will talk about comments when we actually get into the writing the code portion. So again, happy with this. This is how we can get started. It might look different for you. Again, this is the start of a game. So this type of pathway might not make as much sense if you're starting a simulation or a database. Make sure you have your data, calculations, equations, whatever it is you need in place before you start doing this type of planning. I didn't have to go back and do a bunch of thought on my logic and what's going to be going on because I'm pretty familiar with Tic Tac Toe. I've played it a decent amount. So I don't really need to be doing a lot of planning and thinking on that end of what I have access to. This is Tic Tac Toe. It's a game. I know what it is. Again, I've said I'm going to change some rules along the way, probably, but not too much. I'm going to stick to the classic 3 in a row, tic tac toe, win, blah, done.